Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. But this Islamic apologist would have us believe that belief in Allah is necessary, natural, innate.
Allah has created something within us to acknowledge Him and to worship Him.
That cannot be concluded based on the research of Professor Barrett, and to suggest otherwise is to misrepresent Barrett's research. It is to be dishonest. It is to deceive. But I am not surprised.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that.
Evolution is a religion.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of When Theists Fail. And up for today, we have an Islamic apologist to tell us what atheism is and isn't. Gee, I wonder if he'll accurately summarize it. Let's dive right in and find out.
Atheism has nothing to do with philosophy, with science, and with reason. I repeat, atheism has nothing to do with philosophy, with science, or with reason.
That's a bit of an all-encompassing statement, in my view. And by the way, he could be right. There are definitely atheists who are ignorant about philosophy and science, and who are very unreasonable. In fact, I've shared data on this very channel pertaining to atheists and what they go on to believe after they lose their religion. There's some very worrying data that what atheists actually do when they lose their faith is swap it for another supernatural woo. And I can share that data with you, dear listener. As always, the links will be in the description. So I grant him that in the case of certain atheists, it has nothing to do with science, philosophy, or reason. Absolutely nothing to do with those things. But is that true of all atheists? What a ridiculous all-encompassing statement. Like theists, there are theists who are wise. There are theists who are philosophically informed. I covered many of them on this channel. And then there are theists who are completely ignorant about philosophy. There are theists who know a lot about science, and then there are theists who are completely ignorant about science. But I would never assert, like this Islamic apologist has, I would never assert that theism has nothing to do with philosophy, science, or reason. That would be an incredibly ignorant statement. But I guess I should stop expecting more from the apologists that I cover on this channel, because they consistently let me down. But look, in for a penny, in for a pound, as the old saying goes. Let's hear where he goes with this.
We have to understand that the concept of God is a necessary concept, as we believe in our tradition in the concept of the fitrah. We know the fitrah comes from the root that shares the same root with words such as fatrun and fatarahu, that Allah has created something within us to acknowledge Him and to worship Him. So the idea of the belief in God is a natural belief.
Assertion, 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 assertion. Jesus, is he going to actually offer any evidence here? God is necessary, whatever that means.
We have to understand that the concept of God is a necessary concept.
I mean, what does that mean? God is necessary. Does he mean that God's existence is necessary? Is he making a contingency argument here? Does he mean that God is necessary in the sense that we need God in our lives in order to live a good life? Does he mean something else? What a ridiculous statement. Some clarity would be nice, but even without knowing what he means, God is necessary is just an assertion, so I can reject it without even knowing what it means because he hasn't provided any evidence for it. He then goes on to say that God is natural. Belief in God is natural or innate.
So the idea of the belief in God is a natural belief.
Now, maybe that's what he meant by God is necessary. Maybe all he meant was that God is a belief that naturally occurs in every human being. But that's demonstrably false, folks. That is demonstrably false. We have discovered tribes that have no God concept. As always, links will be in the description below. Not to mention the fact that there are many secular nations in the world today where people grow up without any belief in God. So this is demonstrably false. Now, of course, he'll have an ad hoc justification here, and he'll posit, which is where this always goes, by the way, that those people are just suppressing their belief in God. Yet another assertion, I might add. Please demonstrate that belief in God is ubiquitous and innate. And then after you've done that, please demonstrate that those who do not share in that belief are suppressing that belief. You can't do that. These assertions are ridiculous and they can be dismissed as such. I do not have to take seriously that which is asserted. I don't have to take it seriously. I don't have to demonstrate that it's wrong. I can just ask you, what is your evidence? He hasn't provided any, and so therefore I'm entitled to reject the claim. It is really that simple. Assertion, assertion, assertion. The theist's best friend and bedfellow.
So the idea of the belief in God is a natural belief, to the point that the question shouldn't be why God, but the question should be, what reasons do you have to reject God? Because it's part of our own nature.
Wow. Wow. So that's where he was going with this. So he begins by asserting that God is necessary and natural, so much so that it's actually the job of atheists to disprove God.
But the question should be, what reasons do you have to reject God?
A textbook reversal of the burden of proof. If that doesn't reveal the insecurity in his position, I don't know what does. So he's so confident, or so he would claim, in the existence of God that he's not even going to provide any evidence. It's up to you, dear listener. It's up to you, my atheist friends, to disprove his God. That's how confident he is in the existence of his chosen deity. God is natural. Didn't you know? The existence of God naturally occurs to us. Allah has instilled that knowledge within us. God is necessary. So it's your job, dear listener, to prove the non-existence of his unfalsifiable deity. A deity that is described in such a fashion that you cannot interact with the claim. A claim that is so amorphous that no experiment could be created in order to test it. That is the proposition that you have been tasked with. That is the proposition that you've been charged with disproving. And all because he has asserted that belief in God is necessary and natural. Oh my God. Talk about bottom of the barrel. Tell me, dear Islamic apologist, when did you go about disproving the existence of other gods? When did you disprove the existence of Wahe Guru of the religion of Sikhism? I'd love to know. When did you disprove the Trimurti of Hinduism? Tell us, O wise one, because apparently, if somebody's belief is natural and innate, and let's face it, all of the religions make this precise claim, if somebody makes that claim, apparently it's everybody else's job to disprove that deity. So tell us, how did you disprove the Trimurti? How did you disprove Wahe Guru, as well as all of the other thousands of gods that are on offer? Why don't you tell us your method about how you disproved all those other deities, and then I'll use your method to disprove your God, and we'll be able to determine which God at the end of this process of falsification, we'll be able to determine which God is left and which one is real. Sounds okay, right? Sounds like a good plan. But of course, no, he's never going to do that. He's never going to attempt to demonstrate the non-existence of another God, because all those other gods are unfalsifiable as well. This is why reversals of the burden of proof are hogwash. You can't just assert that your God is necessary and that existence of your God has been instilled within us, and then invite everybody who disagrees with you to try and disprove your assertions. That is fallacious in the extreme. And how insulting! How dare you suggest that the existence of your God is innate? Why don't I believe in him? Why don't I have that belief? I can tell you right now, I'm searching my feelings. I don't sense that the existence of God is innate to me. I don't sense that that belief is naturally occurring. Now again, people like this guy will have all sorts of ad hoc justifications. I'm suppressing the belief, or I'm living in sin, or some other bullshit. And that's all it is, by the way, bullshit. It's all camouflage in an attempt to cover up the obvious truth here. You have no evidence for your God. What you have are assertions and reversals of the burden of proof. And to be quite honest, given that that's the case, I've probably spent too long on this point already. So with the greatest of respect, I'm going to move on.
As we see in the hadith in Sahih Muslim, where the Prophet ﷺ said, every child is born in this state, in this natural state. But it is society, his parents and his upbringing that deviate him away from this natural state. And this natural state, brothers and sisters, is confirmed by reality itself. For example, if we look into the works of sociologists, like the evolutionist sociologist Professor Justin Barrett, he did a study on children, and he came to the conclusion that even if you have atheist children and you put them on a desert island, they're going to believe in God.
That's a very selective summary of Professor Barrett's thoughts on this question. Well, luckily, dear listener, I've done the work so that you don't have to. And one of Barrett's findings is that children at the age of 3 actually view all supernatural concepts in their respective culture as equal. And yet you wouldn't have thought that, given the summary that this Islamic apologist offered, would you? But don't take my word for it. Here's Barrett to confirm that for himself.
So children at around age 3 actually treat all of the supernatural agents in their cultural context as about the same, even if the adults don't think that they're all very smart. And this was really shown nicely in a study that Nicola Knight and I did with Maya children on the Yucatan Peninsula. We not only investigated what their view of the Catholic God was, but also the sun god and the forest spirits and some other sort of minor deities who the adults don't regard as particularly smart or clever. But the young children treated them all as super smart. They know everything. And then with age, by the time they're about 7 years old, they're actually starting to discriminate amongst all of these different agents. Which ones are the smart ones, which ones don't know so much, which ones really are even dumber than people. And they start discriminating that already by age 7, while there is developmental support for the idea that, that there is this creator God that's super powerful and super knowing and immortal. It doesn't mean that children are naturally believe in only one God, or believe in God of the Christian tradition, or something like that. That's not the case. They just have an amazing conceptual receptivity to it, as if it's sort of just waiting for the right cultural input to sort of be locked in there. But that doesn't mean they're going to believe in one and only one God. In fact, it looks like humans are naturally predisposed to think about lots of different supernatural beings.
Doesn't this demonstrate that belief in a particular God isn't natural? Doesn't this demonstrate that belief in Allah isn't natural? In fact, what is natural, if this research is to be believed, is that children believe in all sorts of supernatural entities, which is exactly what I would expect from a child, because children don't have skeptical or critical faculties. Children will believe anything you tell them. Children believe in all sorts of crazy things, including the monster in the closet, right? So it's not surprising to me that children will believe in all of these supernatural concepts. But here, the Islamic apologist summarizes this as though belief in Allah is natural.
Allah has created something within us to acknowledge him and to worship him.
And yet these children don't even believe in Allah.
And this was really shown nicely in a study that Nicole Innate and I did with Mayan children.
How appalling is it that this Islamic apologist is using research that was done on a different religious group in order to demonstrate that belief in his chosen deity is naturally occurring, innate, or necessary? How dishonest is that? How inappropriate is that? How utterly ridiculous is that? At best, this research demonstrates that belief in many supernatural beings is naturally occurring and innate.
That doesn't mean they're going to believe in one and only one God. In fact, it looks like humans are naturally predisposed to think about lots of different supernatural beings.
And then as children get older, they begin to prioritize.
And then with age, by the time they're about 7 years old, they're actually starting to discriminate amongst all of these different agents.
Not least, I would suspect, because their parents have had an influence on their thinking at that point. Their parents have encouraged them. Their schooling system has encouraged them. Their society has encouraged them to believe in the deity that's the priority in that given cultural context. But this study, this research that Professor Barrett has done, clearly demonstrates that children view many supernatural entities as being on equal footing. But even if this study did demonstrate that children naturally believe in a God, it's not even the God that this Islamic apologist believes in. This study wasn't done on children who believe in Allah.
And this was really shown nicely in a study that Nicole Innate and I did with Mayan children.
This study didn't demonstrate that children naturally believe in Allah.
Allah has created something within us to acknowledge him and to worship him.
It didn't even demonstrate that children naturally believe in a God. What it demonstrates is that children naturally believe in many supernatural entities.
It looks like humans are naturally predisposed to think about lots of different supernatural beings.
And that with time, they begin to prioritize.
And then with age, by the time they're about 7 years old, they're actually starting to discriminate amongst all of these different agents.
But this Islamic apologist would have us believe that belief in Allah is necessary, natural, innate.
Allah has created something within us to acknowledge him and to worship him.
That cannot be concluded based on the research of Professor Barrett. And to suggest otherwise is to misrepresent Barrett's research. It is to be dishonest. It is to deceive. But I am not surprised. All it takes, dear listener, is a modicum of skepticism, a modicum of interest in the truth, in order to demonstrate that apologists like this are fundamentally mistaken, dishonest, or misrepresenting the facts. And so I have to just dismiss his claims here. No, this study doesn't demonstrate that belief in Allah is necessary or foundational or innate or anything like that. It doesn't demonstrate that at all. In fact, this study might actually serve as compelling evidence against your entire argument. You dishonest son of a...
Also, if you look into, for example, key works in psychology, you have the psychologist who studies religion. Her name is Olivera Petrovich. She has a journal and she discusses that the natural psychological state of the human being is to actually acknowledge God.
Thankfully, in this case, he's honestly represented what the scholar has said. And he's referring, of course, to Olivera Petrovich. Petrovich has based her findings on 2 studies, and I quote, "Her conclusions are largely based on 2 studies, one of Japanese children aged 4 to 6, and another of 400 British children aged 5 to 7 from 7 different faiths." 2 red flags I want to draw your attention to here before we move on. The first is this conclusion that Petrovich has arrived at, i.e. that children have a natural predisposition to believe in God, appears to be based on 2 studies, given what I've just read. One of which is based on 400 children. The numbers for the other study aren't included. But whatever the case may be, it does seem a bit excessive, does seem like a bit of an overstep to form a conclusion about the world's children, about all children, based on 2 studies. The second red flag pertains to the methodology of the 2 studies that Petrovich conducted. If you take a look at the British study, for example, you'll find that this study was carried out and based on 400 children from religious families. Why is that a problem? Well, it shouldn't surprise anyone that children from religious homes believe in God. To assert that belief in God is naturally occurring when your very interview subjects are from religious homes is absurd. Of course they believe in God. They've had God reinforced in their daily lives. They probably go to religious schools, and even if they don't, their parents are religious. These children are from religious homes. And so I want to dismiss that research right off the bat. The Japanese study, admittedly, is far more interesting, far more profound. You see, Japan is an atheistic country, guys. The vast majority of people in Japan are atheists. So when you interview children in Japan and they refer to God, that is interesting and does require some thoughtful consideration. But again, the methodology that Petrovich uses rears its ugly head. And in my view, the questions that she posed to these Japanese children are revelatory. And I quote, "During the second one-week conference on science and the spiritual quest that ended Tuesday in New York, Oxford University psychologist Olivera Petrovich revealed preliminary research data suggesting that the knowledge of a creator might be intrinsic to human existence. Professor Petrovich tested the ability of British and Japanese children to distinguish between physical and metaphysical explanations for certain images. For example, she would show the 4 to 14-year-old children a picture of a book on a table and ask, 'Who put this book there?' The kids replied, 'Mom.' Then she put a picture of the sun in front of them and asked, 'Who placed the sun in the sky?' The young Britons answered, 'God.' And to Petrovich's surprise, their Japanese contemporaries said, 'Kami-sama, God, he did it.' So there you have it, dear listener. We can make a big deal out of the fact that Japanese children answered God when asked who put the sun in the sky, but please notice that that question is a leading one. This is the equivalent of asking a murder suspect, "Where did you hide the bodies?" Please notice that that question is a leading one. If you're asking where did you hide the bodies, you're assuming that the person you're asking is the murderer. There's no way of answering that question that doesn't admit of guilt. If you say, "Well, I'm not going to tell you where I hid the bodies," you're admitting you're a murderer. And if you tell them where you hid the bodies, you're admitting you're a murderer. The question contains a presupposition. And so too does the question that Petrovich asked these children. She asked them, who is responsible for placing the sun in the sky? That question is absurd, methodologically speaking. You cannot ask children that question and pretend like your research is free of corruption. That is ridiculous. Who begs for an agent? If you ask somebody who did something, you're asking for an agent, like a person or a god or a thinking mind. This is ridiculous, folks, and it corrupts the integrity of Petrovich's research. Children are incredibly creative. They're incredibly imaginative. My niece, I have so much fun with her asking her questions and just having conversations with her because you never know what a child is going to say next. If you ask a child who did something, maybe their answer of God is an invention. Maybe it's their creativity. It's not like Japanese children have never heard of God. There are religions in Japan. Have you heard of Shintoism? Japanese people have different views of God. Sure, there's a very high prevalence of atheism, but there are religious concepts in Japan, and God is not a word that they would be unfamiliar with. And when you prime them with a question that has who at the beginning, when you ask them who is responsible for putting the sun in the sky, again, you have just corrupted the question. You have presupposed that there's an agent that is the correct answer. Maybe the children were just trying to satisfy your question. Who knows? I'm certainly not prepared to conclude that therefore children automatically believe in a God. But look, I'm going to put those concerns aside. Let's just forget those concerns. Let's just assume, for the sake of discussion, that these studies have, as the Islamic apologist suggests, proven without question that children have a natural predisposition to believe in God. Fine. Where does that get us? Does that prove that there is a God? Of course not! That's a non sequitur. That just doesn't follow. You cannot say that because something occurs naturally in one's beliefs, that therefore that thing exists. That makes absolutely zero sense. Are you kidding me? And if you don't buy that, dear listener, let me give you an example. Belief in imaginary friends is ubiquitous. Now, that's not to say that every single child does it, but this is clearly a disposition that exists amongst the world's children. Does that mean that those imaginary friends are real? Really? Is that where we're at? Now, some of you might be quick to point out, Magic Skeptic, he's not attempting to argue that God exists. He's merely pointing out that belief in God is naturally occurring and that atheism must be learned. And to that, I'll say this. I'm not that naive. Are you kidding me? Clearly, the implication of his soliloquy is that God exists. His argument is to suggest that there is a factually existing God who instilled knowledge of his existence within us. He believes that Allah has instilled knowledge of his existence in the mind of every human being.
Allah has created something within us to acknowledge him and to worship him.
And if you don't agree that that's the implication of his speech here, I can't help you. All I can say is that his argument is absolutely atrocious. You see, there is so little evidence. The arguments for God's existence are so poor that all the theist has is these kinds of leaps. Belief in God is natural, therefore God exists. That is not how epistemology works. That is not how we form conclusions. You cannot get from this thing occurs naturally in our heads to therefore that thing exists. Or therefore that proposition is true. I'll give you another natural disposition that human beings had for millennia. Belief in the flat earth. That's a pretty naturally occurring belief, confirmed by our experience. The earth appears flat to us when we walk upon it, right? That's a naturally occurring belief. Does that mean that that's true? Does that mean that that proposition is correct? Of course not. That which is naturally occurring to us is not necessarily true. Why do I have to say this out loud? What the hell? I don't care if Petrovich did a study on the entire planet. If she did the largest study ever conducted where every single child on the planet was interviewed and every single child said not only that they believe in a God, let's imagine that every single child on the planet said that they believe in Allah. Let's imagine that was the case. Does that mean that Allah is real? Does that mean that Allah exists? Again, of course not. Oh, brother. It doesn't matter if something is naturally occurring to human beings. It's irrelevant. That is not a reliable pathway to the truth. Not even Professor Barrett agrees with the leap that this Islamic apologist is making. Not even Professor Barrett. The very same professor whose research is a cornerstone of the case that this Islamic apologist is erecting. But don't take my word for it. Allow me to quote Professor Barrett directly. Just because we find it easier to think in a particular way does not mean that it is true, in fact. If we look at why religious beliefs and practices persist in societies across the world, we conclude that individuals bound by religious ties might be more likely to cooperate as societies. Interestingly, we found that religion is less likely to thrive in populations living in cities in developed nations where there is already a strong social support network. And there you have it, dear listener. As the old saying goes, straight from the horse's mouth. Yet, this Islamic apologist would have us believe that this research leads inexorably to the conclusion that a God exists. Meanwhile, the very research he's citing, the very professor, one of them at least, that he's citing, a cornerstone of his case, that very same professor is very clear and very careful to point out that this research doesn't make it any more likely that a God exists. It doesn't have anything to say about the existential question. In fact, Professor Barrett goes on to point out that this so-called innate belief in God actually isn't ubiquitous. It isn't across the board. People who live in cities don't happen to have this natural predisposition to believe in a God or gods. And that absolutely challenges the claims of this Islamic apologists. Think about it. If Allah really does instill within us a sense of his existence, a sense of how necessary he is,
Allah has created something within us to acknowledge him and to worship him.
well then, wouldn't we expect to find that belief everywhere? Wouldn't we expect to find that natural predisposition whether or not someone lives in a city? And yet that's not what the research bears out. But all of these details are left by the wayside. You see, this Islamic apologist very selectively quotes the research that they're sharing with the audience, leaves out the pieces that contradict their case, and leaves out the literal statement by the professor himself that this research lends no credence to the existence of a god or gods. But again, the dishonesty of these apologists knows no bounds. The leaps that they're willing to engage in, the fallacious reasoning and the dishonesty that they're willing to engage in knows no bounds. And you know what? I'm just done. I'm exhausted. I'm so tired of assertions and baseless leaps in logic. I'm so fed up with it. And I have to move on.
Atheism has to be forced on the psyche, on the soul, on the mind of a human being. So from this perspective, we have reality in line with what the Prophet ﷺ told us many, many years ago, that the concept of God is a natural concept.
Really? Is that what the Prophet said? Really? Did the Prophet say that at 3, human beings, children, will naturally believe in all supernatural entities? Is that what the Prophet said?
So children at around age 3 actually treat all of the supernatural agents in their cultural context as about the same.
Did the Prophet then go on to say that by the age of 7, children begin to prioritize?
And then with age, by the time they're about 7 years old, they're actually starting to discriminate amongst all of these different agents.
Is that what the Prophet said? Really? And even if the prophets did in fact say that, even if the Quran mapped onto reality perfectly, who cares? So what? That would be another fallacious leap. If your holy book maps onto reality and gets details correct about the world and about how humans behave and about physics and biology, even if all of that stuff was correct, that wouldn't mean that your God exists. That would not mean that your God exists. This is another fallacious, ridiculous supposition that Islamic apologists flaunt about. They talk about how accurate the Quran is. They never stop talking about how accurate the Quran is and how it gets major details correct about physics and biology and all the rest of it. I'm very skeptical about how accurate the Quran actually is, but this video isn't about that. I just want to make a brief point here in closing. But let's just imagine the Quran was indistinguishable from a science textbook. Let's imagine it got the rate of expansion correct. Let's imagine the Quran contained the correct number for the microwave background radiation. Let's imagine that the Quran knew key details about quantum mechanics and all the rest of it. Let's imagine it was correct about all of those things. Would that prove that there's a God? I mean, I grant you that that would be fascinating as a text as old as it is to get all those details correct. We'd have something worth exploring. It would be worth asking, how did these people get these details correct? But our inability to answer that question, if we were unable to, let's imagine it was correct and we couldn't possibly explain how it was correct or how these people came to these answers thousands of years ago. Let's imagine that all of that was the case. Does that get you to a God? No, it doesn't. Because a mystery doesn't prove God. The only correct response to a mystery is to admit that we do not know how it happened. Mystery, therefore, God is another one of those gigantic, fallacious, ridiculous, and moronic leaps that no skeptic worth their salt should ever engage in. But that's all they've got. Leaps, fallacies, and illogicality. The best friends of your friendly neighborhood, Islamic, Christian, Jewish, you name it, apologists. And so with all that said, dear listener, I'm going to finish the video there. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. That helps out the channel enormously and it costs you nothing. But if you want to take your support of the channel to the next level and you can afford to do so, jump into the description box below. When you get there, you'll find the link to my Patreon. Click that link and you'll be brought to my Patreon page where you can sign up for as little as £3 per month. And for that, and depending on which tier you choose, you will gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. So thank you once again for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.